Good afternoon, Minister Chun Singh, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and a very good morning or evening to you if you're joining us from Europe and the Americas. Welcome to Rajah and Tann Asia's global marquee event, Beyond Pandemic and Politics, Behold Southeast Asia and the World. My name is Yvonne Chan, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. We are truly privileged to have so many friends, clients, business partners, and distinguished guests join us for what we hope to be an engaging and enlightening event. Themed Beyond Pandemic and Politics, Behold Southeast Asia and the World, this event brings together leading global thinkers and business leaders who will share their insights and strategies on how businesses can navigate the pandemic, plan for the emerging new normal, and tap on opportunities in Southeast Asia, one of the world's fastest growing economic regions right now. We hope that the lineup of panel discussions will inspire and enable you to develop the right strategies for your businesses in Southeast Asia as we navigate this ever-changing investment landscape. To start off our program, I'd now like to invite Mr. Lee Beng, Chairman of Rajah and Tann Asia, to deliver his opening remarks. Beng, please.
We are very honored to have as our guest of honor Mr. Chun Singh, Minister for Education, until 15th May this year, Singapore's Minister for Trade and Industry. Thank you, Minister Chan, for gracing our event with your presence. I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to all our clients, business partners, and friends from around the world. My name is Beng, the Chairperson of Rajah and Tann Asia, and I'm delighted to have all of you join our inaugural global seminar, Beyond Pandemic and Politics, Behold Southeast Asia and the World. To state what is obvious and what has quickly become a cliché, we live in unprecedented and challenging times, and with these have come many open and evolving questions, such as what ruptures, remedies, and opportunities has COVID-19 brought about in Asia, and what will emerge from the pandemic? What promises does the recent Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership hold for businesses? How will the US and China approach their strategic interests in Asia? What are the key predictions for sustainability and technology in this part of the world? And last but certainly not least, have the rules and regulatory frameworks in Southeast Asia evolved to match the growth potential the region has to offer? We eagerly anticipate the Minister's keynote speech and also hearing more from our distinguished panelists for the dialogue with global thinkers and business leaders. Piyush Gupta, CEO of DBS Group, Peng, Chairman of Shell Companies in Singapore, and Indra, President of Traveloka. We are also very fortunate to have Parag, Khanna, founder and managing partner of FutureMap, as well as international best-selling author, as our moderator for the Fireside chat with Minister Chan and the dialogue. Our program will conclude with 3 breakout sessions relating to trade, digitalization, and investments. We have with us for the breakout sessions another group of esteemed private and public sector leaders. His Excellency Satvinder Singh from the Asean Economic Community, Pascal Di Petrini from Danone Asia, Ravi Viswanathan from TVS Supply Chain Solutions, Royce Wee from Alibaba Group, Lam Chi Kin from DBS, Aisha Khanna from Ado AI, Damien Chan from the Singapore Economic Development Board, Amit Anand from Jungle Ventures, and Edwin Loh from Credit Suisse. They will be joined by leading partners from the Rajah and Tann Asia offices across Southeast Asia, and I'm confident that their perspectives of business, policy, regulatory, and legal developments will provide much food for thought. We will be recording all sessions, so do not worry if you get to attend only one, as you will be able to watch the others at your leisure after the event. Here at Rajah and Tann Asia, we continue to believe in the Asia story, and particularly in Southeast Asia, which is at the heart of our expertise, knowledge, and connections. We observe the pace of change picking up, the increasing business disruptions brought about by technological and regulatory changes, and how our clients are taking advantage of the compelling factors of production Southeast Asia offers. In other words, this region can be your fastest growing market if you get it right. In our role as a key strategic business and legal partner in Southeast Asia, we sincerely hope that this event will add much value to you and your organization. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to call upon Minister Chan to deliver his keynote address. Minister Chan.
In the spirit of today's hyper-connected world of webinars, instead of good afternoon from Singapore, may I wish everybody good day for all of you joining us from around the world. The pandemic has indeed challenged many of our current assumptions and forced us to rethink our future. However, we should not lose sight of the longer-term driving forces that have been at play prior to and beyond the pandemic. Allow me to start the discussion with two propositions on the driving forces shaping our future. I will then conclude with a third proposition on what all this means for small city-states like Singapore. First proposition, US-China relations define the geopolitical landscape of our time. However, the greatest challenge for both is not the other, but themselves. Second proposition, the new geography of trade is increasingly defined by connectivity rather than distance or demography. And the third proposition is that these circumstances present a unique historical opportunity for city-states like Singapore to defy the odds, to not only survive, but to thrive. Let me start with the first proposition. Many have framed the US-China relation as a zero-sum contest for global leadership. This is overly simplistic. A consequent fallacy is then to ask, which will triumph and how should we hedge our bets? The strategic rivalry between the US and China will remain a feature of the international system for time to come. Neither will collapse in the foreseeable future, and certainly not from the pressures from the other party. But rivalry and competition do not equate to being enemies. Contest they will, from areas of economics to finance. Cooperate they can, from North Korea to climate change. Conflict they need not end up in. Both countries have achieved historical milestones in the last 100 years. The US ascended to global leadership after the First World War and consolidated its position thereafter. No country or empire in history has achieved such dominance and reach in military, economic, and geopolitical influence. On the other hand, China is fast catching up in terms of its economic prowess, after more than 40 years of economic reforms and integration with the global economy. However, it still lacks the military reach and geopolitical influence of the US. And this is key. Victory will not be defined by the defeat of the other party, but who can win over the rest of the world. Victory will not be defined by the defeat of the other party, but by who can win over the rest of the world. Victory will depend on the power of their example rather than the example of their power. And this starts from the domestic front. The greater their success in managing their respective domestic challenges, the greater their confidence to relate to each other as partners. The more they struggle to resolve their domestic challenges, the greater their risk of falling prey to their respective hardliners who desire to paint the other side as the source of all their problems. A straight line trajectory for China to overtake the US is not a given. China grapples with various challenges. How to secure its global supply chains and markets. How to grow rich before it grows old. How to leverage on the dynamism of the market and the discipline of the market without ceding political control. How to manage the economic divide between the rural and the urban, between the coastal provinces and the inland provinces. The US preeminence also cannot be taken for granted, as it too has its own fair share of challenges. How to unite a country divided by party, ideology, race, and class. How to achieve long-term policy coherence and inspire confidence in its global commitments beyond the vagaries of its political cycles. How to continue attracting talent and the best from the rest of the world while managing its social tensions. And how to allow its best to run fast without inequality shackling the whole society. The rest of the world will closely study their development models and exercise of power. Countries will then gravitate towards the partner that aligns best with their own long-term strategic requirements, development needs, and security interests. So while the US and China constitute up to 1/3 of global GDP, the remaining 2/3 of the world can and must exercise collective agency to uphold and update global integration to avoid a bifurcated or fragmented world. Let me now move on to the second proposition. A new geography of trade is emerging, and it is defined by connectivity rather than distance or demography. Economic ties and value chain integration have historically been shaped by distance. Proximity promotes interdependence. However, the reduction of transport costs, the rise of the digital economy, and the considerations for supply chain resilience are all reshaping the global connectivity map. The pandemic has brought to the fore multinational companies' considerations of supply chain resilience, market diversity, and having trusted partner in deciding where to put their investment and global production layout. Beyond distance, the more salient considerations will increasingly be connectivity of data and financial flows, harmonization of rules and standards for intellectual property protection, the ability to mobilize capital and aggregate talent, the ability to remain connected to the global trading system, especially in times of crisis. A globally connected economy will always be more attractive than a locally protected economy. Economic resilience will come more from connectivity and diversity rather than autarky. Now, let me now discuss how these two propositions impact small city-states like Singapore. There's a Chinese saying regarding small states, 小国无外交, or small states do not have foreign policy choices. It is often used to remind small states of their place in life, rather discouraging. There is a more poignant Chinese saying, 选边站就靠边站，靠边站就得选边站. If you choose sides, you become irrelevant. If you are irrelevant, you have no choice but to choose sides. This is perhaps much more encouraging, for it suggests that even small states are not without agency. For Singapore, choosing sides or hedging are not our forte or strategy. Being a principled and relevant partner is. We stand for an inclusive and connected world, and we do not adopt a zero-sum mentality. We work with like-minded partners as part of the other 2/3 of the world to build a rules-based global order for trade and security. We believe that if we can deeply understand and appreciate the priorities of our partners, be they superpowers or regional neighbors, we can value add to the relationship constructively. We cannot rely on our geographical location, natural resources, or population size for our relevance. Instead, we create our relevance through a strategy of connectivity with the world. Across the physical dimensions of air, land, and sea connectivity, and across the non-physical dimensions of data, finance, regulations, technology, and talent. This is why, beyond conventional free trade agreements, we are developing a new generation of digital economy agreements for us to harmonize the rules with our major trading partners and with the rest of the world. As a multiracial society with a deep appreciation of diversity, we can help bridge differences and find common ground. As a society with a set of forward-looking values and ideals of meritocracy and incorruptibility, we seek to attract the most talented and committed to join us to build a nation that can stand the test of time. In a world of uncertainties, we provide a safe harbor with policy consistency and coherence for investors to plant their long-term investments here and for their global businesses to operate out of Singapore as a keynote in their global network and value chains. This, in turn, creates good jobs for our people. So, ladies and gentlemen, we began today by asking what lies beyond. Although we are grappling with significant uncertainties, there are reasons for us to be optimistic in Singapore. Beyond the US and China, countries are neither without agency nor responsibility. All of us can pull together to uphold the global trade and security orders. All of us can embrace the new dimensions of connectivity that frees us from the tyranny of geography and demography. This is why I believe small states like Singapore have the best chance in history to defy the odds, to not only survive, but to thrive. With the world as our hinterland and market for resources, talent, and ideas. We promise not a large domestic market, but a diversified, resilient global market. We promise not just a highly skilled set of domestic talent, but also a large global talent network. And we promise a principled and relevant partnership that can stand the test of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Chan, for that very insightful keynote, which rightfully sets the stage for the rest of the panel discussions to follow. You've expounded on the benefits of a globally connected economy and also reminded us how Singapore can continue to create relevance by boosting our connectivity with the rest of the world. So thank you very much. I'd now like to move on to the next segment of our program, and it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Parag Khanna, the founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a leading global strategy advisor and best-selling author, to join Minister Chan for a fireside chat. They will discuss developments around the world and its impact on Southeast Asia and Singapore. Now, for this segment of the program, we have invited you, our attendees, to be a part of the fireside chat by submitting your questions before the event. Now, if you haven't already done so, you can still post your questions by going to www.slido.com and keying in that code on your screen, 883182, or you can simply scan the QR code that's just popped up on your screen right now. And I'd like to hand the time over to Minister Chan and Parag for the fireside chat. Gentlemen, please.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Minister Chan, thank you for joining us today. I believe that was the clearest articulation of Singapore's position in the world that we have heard in some time, and we're very honored and privileged to have heard it directly from you today. Thank you so much for kicking off this event with those remarks. And of course, I couldn't agree more that the future geography of trade and finance and power will be defined by connectivity. And you've made a strong case for Singapore as a connected hub. Today, of course, our main geographic aperture is ASEAN. So can you make the case also for ASEAN? How connected do you see ASEAN getting, both internally and externally?
As you rightly pointed out, I think there are two dimensions of connectivity that ASEAN has to pay attention to in the coming years. But before we go into that two dimensions of both the internal and external to ASEAN connectivity, I think the first thing that we must remember is that distance itself, distance alone, can no longer guarantee integration or even be the primary reasons that drive integration. So once we get that out of our mind, then we will entirely focus on how we can use the complementarities within ASEAN to strengthen ourselves as a value proposition to the world, and how ASEAN then must connect to the rest of the world and diversify its markets and also the sources of its resources. So let's start domestically first. It's always been said that ASEAN is a 600 million people market, but that is just a aggregate macro number. What is more important is that the ASEAN population is relatively young compared to many other regions of the world. Then there is a demographic dividend, if you like, that ASEAN can enjoy. But having said that, a demographic dividend can only come about if we have closer integration of the type of rules that we have that allow us to be a truly integrated market or a more integrated market that makes us a more valued proposition to investors beyond ASEAN. So be it the flow of data, the connectivity of finance, the rules that allow people to set up companies within ASEAN that are unified and harmonized, all these are value propositions that ASEAN can have, but they are also all things that ASEAN countries must work towards, and rather than to assume that they are all there. And that is how we can make ASEAN a much more value proposition to major powers like China, the US, India, Japan, or even Europe. And we need to keep thinking ASEAN as an integrated whole rather than ASEAN as 10 different separated markets. Now, having said that, then we move on to the second part of the consideration. ASEAN, with its population and its dynamism, can be a key plank in the global economy. But that doesn't mean that ASEAN will need to choose sides or only go with one particular partner. In fact, just like any other parts of the world, it is in our interest to have a portfolio of relationships, so that ASEAN is truly the hub or the bridge to bring people together, rather than to say that we are only working with certain parties and not others. And that will be the strongest value proposition that ASEAN can bring to the table on the global scale. Be it partners from Europe, Japan, India, China, US, or elsewhere. ASEAN can be the place whereby people come together for the meeting of minds and ideas.
You mentioned digital standards and harmonization, intellectual property as well in your remarks. Those are so important for the legal industry and for all foreign investors who are looking at tapping that larger marketplace. How about the sequencing or the timeline for those key issues within the ASEAN framework? Singapore, of course, pushes for this. Singapore is a leader in this regard. Are you feeling that this is rising up the agenda? Is there a timeline that one can give around that?
I think there are two sets of forces that many countries in ASEAN are feeling at the same time. In times of great uncertainty, there will be calls, especially on the domestic front, for us to close up our market so that we can protect the local players. And some people mistakenly think that this will make us much more resilient. But that is actually quite furthest from the truth. Because by being on our own, we become much less resilient. And no country in ASEAN can ever claim to have the full suite of capabilities that will allow it to operate on its own without the interdependence that they can achieve, which will benefit all of us. So that is the local domestic pressures in all countries, not just within ASEAN, but across the world. But on the other hand, I think there are increasingly voices, particularly from businesses, that says that we want a global market, we want greater integration rather than this fragmented global system. And actually, many of the global companies are at the forefront of pushing this agenda of encouraging the respective governments to come together to harmonize the rules so that global businesses can operate across borders rather than be artificially constrained by the geographical or political boundaries. So there is a tension between these two sets of forces. For Singapore, because maybe we are small, we are entirely focused. We never believe that we can survive on the basis of domestic market. And our vision is always one of being connected to the rest of the world so that the world is our hinterland, the world is our market. And because of that, we like to work with like-minded countries and like-minded companies to push forward this agenda of global integration. And this is particularly relevant at this point in time where there is an overlay of geopolitical tensions which threatens to bifurcate the world. And all the more, what I call the other 2/3 of the world must come together to uphold the standards that we want to see going forward in our operating system.
I want to come back to the global order in just a moment, but many of our participants, many of our viewers are, of course, in Singapore and very interested in the dynamics economically within Singapore at the moment. I think we have all here benefited from the security, from the stability that the government has provided, but during the pandemic, but it has come as at an economic cost, both to the government and to businesses. But the government continues to telegraph a very strong commitment to supporting businesses and communities. Now we find ourselves in the midst of unfortunate, and hopefully temporary lockdown again at the moment. But can you give us a sense of the economic picture for the remainder of this year? Can you foresee structural shifts in the budget, maybe even deeper policy shifts towards greater support for various constituencies beyond the pandemic timeframe?
There are a number of factors that will affect the economic performance of the country in the next 12 to 24 months. The key driver will be how the global economic recovery gathers pace or not. At this point in time, the pace of recovery across the world is uneven, but perhaps even more worrying is not just the uneven pace of recovery, it is that there are pockets in the world that continue to be petri dishes for potential variants of concern for the virus trajectory. And if that comes about, we will continue to see this start-stop recovery on the global scale. And Singapore will very much like to see everyone joining hands so that we can minimize the chances of this unhealthy trajectory from persisting. Now, on the other hand, notwithstanding all these uncertainties, we have to ask ourselves in Singapore, how do we position ourselves even with all these uncertainties? How do we take advantage of our strengths and build on them, and then to prepare for our world, for a world that is what we call a post-COVID world, or learning to live in a COVID world? We never believed that we are going back to the pre-COVID days. And there are a few things that I think have changed since the COVID days, accentuated by COVID. First is this issue of connectivity. I think in the past, a lot of people would pretty much focus connectivity in the air, land, and sea dimensions. That's how we have made a name for ourselves, being the air hub, the sea hub, and so forth. And all those still remain relevant. But going forward, for many of the companies, including Rajah and Tann, the more important dimensions of connectivity is not just the air, land, and sea links, which are still important, but increasingly, it's about the protection of the intellectual property, the data flow, the financial flows that will allow companies like Rajah and Tann to grow beyond Singapore. And this is why, in terms of strategy, we will go after a new set of agreements with our economic partners so that we can facilitate and tighten the linkages on the dimensions of data connectivity, financial connectivity, and even the rules which people operate across the borders. So that's all very important. The second strategy that will distinguish ourselves going forward vis-a-vis other countries is that we must leverage on our political stability to provide a safe harbor for others to mobilize capital and aggregate talent. Because in today's world, the ability to think long-term and plan long-term is actually not so common. Not many places in the world afford major companies to do that. And in Singapore, this is where we think we can provide a niche areas. So when we attract investments into Jurong Island, be it some of the petrochemical plants or some of the biopharma companies, they are all here not because they think they're going to recover their capital in the next 5 or even 10 years. They are here because they want an environment that can provide them that sort of return in the next 20 to 30 years. So that's one part of it. Now, the other part that is very important for us is that we must continue to be a place that allow major companies from around the world to aggregate their talent. Global companies want to build global teams. teams that can serve the global market. For us to be a global hub, we must be able to continue to allow talent from all over the world to be aggregated in Singapore, strengthen the Team Singapore, be part of Team Singapore, so that we can serve the global markets from Singapore. So these are the key strategies that will position us well in a COVID world and going beyond a COVID world.
US-China tension is one of the areas that's only been exacerbated by the pandemic. It's something that's accelerated, deepened, sharpened really over the last 5 years. Many people were surprised that it has gotten, some would say, worse or more intense despite the election of Joe Biden in the United States, for example. And that brings us to your point about the other 2/3 of the world. And I think you painted a very stark picture of the structural US-China rivalry, but you also stood your ground very firmly on Singapore's position in that. And it's, again, an excellent articulation of what I call multi-alignment, right? Not choosing sides, not being forced to choose sides, but instead developing fruitful win-win partnerships with China, the United States, India, Europe, Japan, Australia, in a 360-degree sort of way. So when it comes to how geopolitics can actually enhance Singapore's role and ASEAN's role, there's been a raft of new initiatives, the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, the T10, the Quad, and so forth. And all of those are efforts to distribute the production of critical technologies, to ensure data privacy, and in the distribution of production more generally across industries. Beyond China, this will benefit India, this could benefit ASEAN. So what is your sense of how rapidly ASEAN in general, Singapore in particular, are taking advantage of the strategic interest that's coming into this region, and what more can be done to develop it faster?
Well, I can't speak for the rest of the ASEAN countries, but I think from Singapore's perspective, we can say the following things. If we want to remain as a relevant partner to all these major powers and neighboring countries, we need to have a deep sense of understanding of their priorities. And we need a very nuanced understanding of their priorities so that we go beyond the zero-sum mentality. Because no matter how different other people's priorities may be, we believe that if we truly understand them, then we can try to value add by trying to find common ground that can serve both markets. And we can, and on top of serving the respective markets. So this is key. And how can we achieve this? We can only achieve this if our people continue to travel and connect with the rest of the world, be it physically or virtually. Our people continue to build the relationships with the rest of the world, be it China, US, or the rest of the countries, and have a deep understanding, a nuanced understanding of where their priorities are. This is priority number one for us. Now, having said that, as I mentioned in my speech, there will be areas whereby they will compete. They will certainly compete. And competition in itself is not a zero-sum game. A competition in itself does not mean that they must come to blows with one another. Competition in itself can also promote better products and services. And the rest of the world will be keenly watching what both sides offer to them, be it in the areas of technology, security, or economic models. So I think for ASEAN, all the ASEAN countries will take a close look at what the two countries offer, or for that matter, what third parties beyond the US and China will offer in terms of the kind of experiences that they can share in their development trajectory, in their security model, in their geopolitical perspective. So actually, ASEAN need not be confined to just the US and China as a binary option. ASEAN should look out and see the rest of the world as it is, and say that actually we can learn something from different parts of the world to strengthen our system as a whole. And actually, if we take this perspective, I believe that ASEAN will come out much stronger than having just to contend with the choices of US versus China, because that is a forced choice.
Right. China now trades more with ASEAN bilaterally, and this was before the passage of RCEP, than it does with the United States, second only to its trade with the European Union. But Europe and the Western powers look at ASEAN as potentially an integrated top 5 economic region in the world. But when it comes to supply chains and value chains, it's still quite underdeveloped in the sense that it's viewed as China plus one, right? One that cannot really yet view ASEAN countries collectively as an alternative production center with that degree of output that China has been delivering and has mastered in many ways over the last couple of decades. Other than the wage arbitrage has been very beneficial to Thailand, to Vietnam, and so forth. What do you see as the steps that can be taken, and how can Singapore invest into that trend of helping to elevate and build the capacity of the rest of ASEAN? Because I have found in the last 10 years, the more the Singapore Inc. portfolio has now shifted towards an ever greater weight, whether it's GLCs or otherwise, to ASEAN. They have a market-making function, right? The rest of the world says, aha, Temasek, GIC are taking a lead role. They have done the due diligence. They are willing to put capital into these markets. We will now do that. So what do you see as that role that Singapore plays? It is very much, as you know, I call Singapore the capital of Asia. So now more than ever is an opportunity to build that ASEAN capacity.
So I'll say a couple of points in response to that. I don't think for the major corporations in the world it's a case of China plus one or India plus one. Perhaps a sharper analogy of what they are, a sharper way to put what they are thinking is called anything but one.
Right.
It's not China plus one or India plus one, it's anything but one. And that's because people understand the need for resilience. It's an old adage that you don't put all eggs in one basket. And in a pandemic world or in a post-pandemic world or in a world fraught with geopolitical tensions, how do you lay out your global supply chains such that it is anything but one so that you don't have a single point of failure? So I think that is the mindset that everybody is taking around the world. But that means that it presents opportunities for many other people to compete on the basis, not just on the basis of cost. In fact, Singapore, we compete never on the basis of cost, but we compete on the basis of our reliability. So even during the pandemic, we have global operations coming out from Singapore that were not disrupted by the pandemic nor man-made policies to stop exports of certain critical goods, because we continue to hold firm to this position that we must fulfill our promise as a global hub, as part of the global value chain. And this is not something that is new to us. In fact, back in the days of the oil embargo in the 1970s, we continue to make sure that the companies that have planted their investments in Singapore can continue to service their global operations to fulfill our promise. And that is how I think that the brand of trust, allow us to build up Jurong Island to what it is today. And we have every intention to make sure that we continue to hold on to this brand of trust, so that when people look at the global production and investment layout and people adopt anything but one mindset, then we are in play. So that's critical to us. Now, beyond that of seizing the opportunity of the anything but one, it is also important for us to dig deep and ask ourselves, how can we strengthen our position as a business hub? The conventional roles of a business hub has changed. In the past, people might come to Singapore because there's a need to physically connect. But this will change, and in fact, many people in the world today ask this question: do we still need to have physical hubs? Our sense is that there will still need for physical hubs because people are essentially social. But the role that hubs play will change, and Singapore must change together with these expectations. Hubs will no longer just be a point where people physically gather. Hubs must be places where people can aggregate capital seamlessly, aggregate talent seamlessly, and protect intellectual property seriously. So these are the real value propositions of the new hubs that we will see in the world. And there is every reason why Singapore has even a better chance than the past to compete on this basis. Because once we free ourselves from the tyranny of geography and demography, then really the sky's the limit for us to compete on what we call the intangibles. So I think these are opportunities that we can seize these are also opportunities that the rest of ASEAN can come together and seize.
Many of the points you've made actually really speak to, you used the word talent many times, regulation, looking at, again, data standards, the physical, the economic, the digital, the geopolitical. The legal profession actually does have to grapple with all of these at the same time. And in that spirit, whether they're dealing with cross-border M&A, technology companies, foreign investment, your points are very, very valid, and they speak to Singapore's potential, of course, to deepen its role as a legal hub. Could you offer a final comment in just a moment that we have left around Singapore as a legal hub?
I think our positioning as a legal hub has been growing nicely over the last few years, and we have every intention to continue to grow this role. And the key reason for us to become a significant legal hub in the global landscape has to do with just one word, which is trust. So long as people trust the Singapore system, the other countries trust Singaporean as a people, and the world trusts Singapore to uphold the rule of law in a fair and transparent manner, and with policy coherence and consistency across time, there's every reason for us to believe that we can become one of the key global legal hubs of the world.
Very well put. In Singapore, we trust, I think,
Yes,
can be a memorable line from this conversation. Minister Chan, thank you so much for sharing your remarks, your insights with us today. It's greatly appreciated by everyone here at Rajah and Tann and around the world for those participating. Please, everyone, join me in thanking the Minister for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Parag.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And back to Yvonne.
Thank you very much, Minister Chan and Parag, for that most engaging dialogue. In Singapore, we trust. Trust has to form the tenets of the foundation for Singapore's future. Ladies and gentlemen, Minister Chan will now be taking his leave. On behalf of the organizing committee at Rajah and Tann Asia, we would like to express our deepest gratitude to Minister Chan for gracing our event with his presence, as well as for sharing his illuminating remarks today. Thank you, Minister Chan. We're now going to move on to the next segment of our program, and this upcoming panel discussion has been much anticipated and will be highly insightful. Our distinguished panel will address the challenges that many businesses in Southeast Asia are currently facing. They'll also talk about what new innovations and strategies they've adopted for their business models and how enterprises can reap opportunities in the new world order and be future ready. Our distinguished panel comprised of the following individuals: Mr. Piyush Gupta, the CEO of DBS Bank; Ms. Peng, the chairman of the Shell companies in Singapore; Mr. Indra, president of Traveloka; and Mr. Chia Huat, the regional head of corporate and transactional practice at Rajah and Tann. A very warm welcome to one and all. I'd now like to hand the time back to our moderator for today, Mr. Parag Khanna, to drive the discussion. Parag, over to you.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. It was such a pleasure to hear from Minister Chun Sing, and we get a chance now to reflect on his insights, but also to broaden and deepen and get into a more specific agenda around topics ranging from sustainability to the financial landscape, the impact of disruptive technologies, especially here in ASEAN. And this is going to be a fast-paced and wide-ranging conversation. We'll be taking your questions as well. So the first thing we're going to do, this kickoff question, is something of a lightning round, if you will. And the question to our distinguished panelists who are joining us both here in person, Huat, thank you, as well as online, is the following. Before the pandemic, Southeast Asia was one of the fastest growing regions of the world. And now the specific question to each of you is, how has the pandemic and the geopolitical landscape altered your strategies and business plans? And in brief, what do you see as the biggest risk and the biggest opportunity moving forward? And as I said, this will be a lightning round, just 1 to 2 minutes to get each of your views. And if we could begin with Piyush Gupta of DBS. Piyush, thank you for being with us. Your views, please.
Well, thanks for having me here, Parag. I thought you and the minister were pretty comprehensive, but in your lightning round, let me just mention, I think the biggest opportunity is really the tremendous A, acceleration in digitization, and B, the tremendous focus on sustainability. I think both digitalization and sustainability will need more than ever the presence of different kind of hubs. And I think Singapore really has the opportunity capacity to be a hub of this new world, a sustainability hub as well as a digital hub. What I call the new infrastructure, the new rails of the new digital economy. We really have the capacity to be there. I think the risks are also quite clear. I think the minister alluded to both of them. One is, I think there is genuinely a risk of geopolitics. Even though we're trying to stay in the middle of both sides, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be quite tricky to dance between the dragons fighting there. I think that's a real risk. The other risk is that the ASEAN philosophy, which is slowly bilateral, etc. philosophy, does lead to situations where a common agenda is not that easy. So there is a sense of nationalism, there is a sense of protectionism, and being able to overcome that won't necessarily be very easy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Piyush. So digitization as the opportunity, but geopolitics as the risk. If I can pose the same question to Peng. Do we have her on the screen or on audio? Oh, not yet. Okay. In that case, we'll move straight to Caesar Indra of Traveloka.
Thank you. Just a quick overview of Traveloka. Traveloka was started in 2012. We started to solve a seemingly simple problem to simplify travel from Indonesia to the world. And as we grew, we continued to solve problem throughout consumer journey. And we noticed a similar problem exists in the region of Southeast Asia, market by market. And we tried to apply similar solution only with local flavor. And today we are operating in 7 markets, offering 20 products across travel, local services, and financial services. Southeast Asia is the fastest growing and most exciting region in the world today. And throughout this pandemic, actually even before pandemic, we've seen that there is a trend of digitalization, and the pandemic only accelerated the process of digitalization. In our platform, we see that a lot of people demand more of healthcare services. They want to know information about where to take the COVID-19 test, and they book through our app. Mm-hmm. And there's also a shifting trend from going out to at-home services. So we've seen a rise in food delivery in our platform. And I think the trend will remains the same post-pandemic as well. Secondly, I think in Southeast Asia, there is a big financial inclusion gap. And I think that exists in many markets except Singapore. For example, in Indonesia, we've seen low credit card penetration, and that's because lack of information about consumer, and becoming a challenge for a lot of banks to offer credit to these consumers. And I think this trend this gap will continue to exist, but there's a significant opportunity for corporates who are able to understand more about their consumers and provide the right financial service offering.
Excellent. To them. Financial inclusion most certainly as a risk to the overall growth profile of the region. That's a very good point. Well, Huat, you have a home court advantage. Thank you again for joining me here. How about your view on biggest opportunity, biggest risk pre versus post pandemic?
Thanks, Parag. First, let me start with the risk. I'll identify 3 of them. One is the US-China strategic competition. As we know, both of them are actually big customers as well as suppliers of ASEAN, and their conflict may lead to supply chain disruption as well as trade issues. Mm-hmm. 2 is climate change. As we have seen, it has led to devastating floods across the region, from Germany to China to the Philippines as well. And the rising sea level may submerge actually many cities in Southeast Asia. Third would be the technology disruption. You know, many businesses in Southeast Asia are traditional college industries, small businesses, and many of them has to cope with the digitalization as we move into a no-touch or low-touch economy. Mm-hmm. So, as the Chinese saying goes, 危机 means wherever there are risks, look for the opportunities. And I also touch on the 3 opportunities. One, notwithstanding the US-China strategic competition, Southeast Asia is emerging as an important neutral manufacturing hub. Mm-hmm. A lot of them are relocating to Southeast Asia so that they can remain connected to the 2 trading blocs. Two, sustainability industry. 2021 is actually the year of China-ASEAN sustainable collaboration. As we know, China is actually the largest renewable market. They are the world leader in solar and wind so-called power, and they are talking about green BRI. So ASEAN actually can tap into China expertise in this area. And third is the data economy. Under the ASEAN Digital Master Plan 2025, technology can be used to spur economic and social development. So those are the three opportunities.
Excellent. Well, now we're going to get to speak in a horizontal way about each of the major topics that you've already raised in your opening comments: data and digitalization, sustainability, and finance and financial infrastructure. Let's start with data and digitalization.
But I think Peng's on.
Oh, is that right? Peng, do you hear us?
I do.
Ah, wonderful. Perfect timing. Can we get your view on the biggest risk and opportunity for ASEAN pre and post-COVID, or especially now post-COVID? What do you see as opportunities and weaknesses for the region? We've heard on the positive side, digitization, which has benefited all of the companies present here and listening, but there are concerns, of course, about geopolitics, about climate change, about financial inclusion. What would be your view?
Yeah, thanks, Parag. Hopefully you can still hear me.
Yes.
I think clearly both the risk and opportunity is in energy transition. As a region, Southeast Asia has plenty of potential for growth. We've known that for a very long time. I mean, Shell as a company has been in this region for well over 100 years in many, many places. And we've always seen that potential for growth, right? As economies grow, they need energy to power that growth. The question then will be, how would they think about the energy that they need for growth, and think of it with a frame of, can it be greener? How will they tackle energy transition? How will they deal with issues like circularity, renewable feed, and so on and so forth? So I think for us, we see energy transition as both a risk and opportunity for Southeast Asia.
Excellent. Well, that is overlaps in some way and reinforces what Huat has said. It could well be that it's a great risk to the region, where in Asia there isn't one common climate change policy, but the transition itself and investing into it brings a huge potential. We're going to come back to sustainability. I want to drill down on digitization, which all of you has mentioned as something so critical, and get each of your views. It is so fundamental to boosting the services sector in the region, to keeping pace with the latest standards, unlocking the consumer base. So digitization is really a big platform, but also a big wild card. Piyush, fintech has been muscling in on traditional finance, from payments to retail, investment management even. What have been the most significant digital breakthroughs, and how are you best taking advantage of them?
Well, I think, Parag, it's, there are 3 or 4 big themes. One is just obviously changing the customer experience by providing digital access. Obviously, the mobile phone's a big part of that. But in general, being able to access financial services on the fly in context has been a game changer. Obviously, if you can invest, and if countries can invest in the accompanying infrastructure, for example, payment infrastructures, that allows instancy, whether for domestic payments or cross-border payments. So that helps. But overall, the digitization helps the customer experience in significant ways. The second big thing that's been important is the value of data. Increasingly, the availability of data, or the 3 V's, volume, variety, veracity of data, whatever, velocity has been massive. And as you get your hands around the data, then you can obviously take incremental compute power, AI, machine learning, etc., to start making a lot more sense of things you couldn't do before. Now, this has got significant advantages. It allows you to, for example, in finance, allows you to provide credit to those parts of the population who would normally be deprived, because you can use different kinds of lending algorithms, etc. And so data itself is a big differentiator. Mm-hmm. A third thing that's happening, which is increasingly beginning to get more and more attention, is the whole notion of distributed ledger technology. These DLTs are not only driving better blockchain solutions, but they're calling into question the very existence of finance as we know it, a hub and spoke arrangement, being replaced by what's now called DeFi, decentralized finance arrangement. Now, Obviously, the third, the blockchain agenda, is in very early days, but quite clearly, we see a lot of interest in some of those things as well. You talked about fintech muscling in. I think you got to go back to figure what is the essence that finance does. If you take finance at its essence, is helping people save, it's helping people transfer money around, it's helping people make investments, it's helping companies and corporations borrow. Those fundamentals are quite immutable, and frankly, everybody has the opportunity to participate in those. The incumbent players have as much opportunity to reimagine how it is done as do new technology players. And therefore, it's not a case of who muscles in on who. It is a case of how do you take and leverage and avail of the new technologies to change the way things are done. I think that's where the world is going.
Excellent. A very confident statement and a great overview also of the technological disruptions that are part of the digitization issue. Can I turn to you on this? Because Singapore ranks #1 in digital readiness, according to the World Economic Forum's most recent survey. It's the region's legal hub as well. But there are tricky issues that lie ahead when it comes to intersecting of the virtual aspect of digitization and the geographical and the political, because we still don't have one common regional data privacy agreement. We don't have an equivalent of GDPR. Data localization policies are strengthening rather than converging. Only New Zealand and Singapore have this sort of digital trade pact. So there's a long way to go in terms of accomplishing the inclusive digitization agenda across the region. What can the legal sector do to encourage and push this digitization agenda and harmonization?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think Minister Chan alluded to the word trust earlier. Yeah. Singapore is a trusted partner. So from our work, we can see that a lot of the MNCs are setting up data centers in Singapore to host the data. Why? Because they feel that Singapore is a secure environment and that our laws protect the security of the data. And the other challenges is what I call cybersecurity. Increasingly, you hear a lot about cybersecurity attacks. And Singapore is well known for strict law enforcement. If we do think that there's a theft on data, we will take enforcement actions. Right. So with all those reputation, it helps to promote Singapore actually as the data hub and the data exchange. But increasingly, we also, as what Piyush was saying, data is actually seen as an important currency, right, that you can trade. Right. And a lot of people are getting more protective. We already see many countries coming out with their own data security law. China has just come up with its own data security law. Indonesians are talking about whether the data can be used overseas to the extent they are mined in Indonesia. I think that posed a lot of cross-border data exchange issues, which actually Singapore is well placed to help resolve many of them.
Cesar, can we turn to you on this? Because, of course, digital harmonization very much advances your business. You've branched out beyond Indonesia. You've been buying online travel firms in Vietnam and the Philippines. What are the key elements of your next digital strategies? And what do you need to see happen? What do you want to see happen when it comes to digital convergence and harmonization in ASEAN?
I think even before the pandemic, our business strategy hasn't changed. So during this pandemic, we've seen that our business plan has been accelerated, and you see there's an acceleration in digitalization, and we've seen that people have shifted their preference in lifestyle, and from one product in another category. And for example, we've seen during this pandemic there is a trend in healthcare, and we try to really capture that opportunity by introducing a number of healthcare products in our platform. And you're right in terms of data protection, data related issue. Technology will always evolve faster than the regulation, and it's very important for technology players for us to really comply with the local law and regulation and work closely with the regulator and have an open communication to really shape the regulation together, and hence it can benefit the overall our overall business and the economy. And I think there is also, other than that, we see that technology is more and more becoming an integral part of people's life, and a tech company like us carries a bigger responsibility in terms of protection of consumer data and privacy, and it's really important for companies to prioritize this over the next decade.
One of the very important points you just made is around regulation, because when you're talking about a very frontier area, such as the digital domain is, it is incumbent upon the responsible firms, whether they're in finance or tech, to actually help shape these regulations in a common way, on a common platform, because we have very different levels of capacity for regulation across ASEAN. So the firms do have a very critical role to play. This is a very much a public-private issue. So thank you for all of the comments on digitization.
If I can come in and just make a couple of comments. The first is this, and just going back to what you're saying, the reality is that the ASEAN approach through all of the history is not one which suggests that we can suddenly come up with an ASEAN free trade agreement which will come to a common consensus on data or data exchanges of trade. I'm not holding my breath on that. It's not something ASEAN has been able to achieve in the past. However, to your point, ASEAN has been singularly successful because, as somebody once said, ASEAN grows at night when the governments are asleep.
Right.
The people-to-people exchanges, the customer exchanges, and the efforts of people like Caesar and his company are what drives the connectivity across ASEAN. So I have a lot of hope that the private sector and individuals and consumers, through their choices, are going to be a big catalyst of what needs to happen. Second thing in the ASEAN approach is, even though you don't have a multilateral arrangement, ASEAN is very open to bilateral arrangements. And therefore, I can see a number of bilateral DEAs, digital agreements happening in ASEAN, which catalyze the process. And finally, I think at a general level, at a multilateral level, what ASEAN does well, which is what I think could drive a digital future, is specific projects. So projects around a common payment infrastructure, which people are being, Singapore is talking to Thailand on PromptPay, for example. Projects around a common AML construct. Projects around a common supply chain and trade financing system. I think if ASEAN actually gets its mind around some of these infrastructure-connected large projects, that could help accelerate the process a little bit.
Those are great examples for sure. The swap lines with central banks, the trade finance agreement, AML, these are all excellent areas where, and quite frankly, there are some international conventions or best practices that already one can borrow from, in the same way that Asia has been borrowing from the WTO and other trade frameworks for a long time and making them its own. Any other final comments on digitization?
Actually, on that,
please.
I think let Kapeng speak first.
Please, Kapeng.
Yes.
Well, I thought one thing we need to really recognize is how does it affect individuals? We talk at the corporate level, we talk at the regional level of what can be done, but within companies, it's a whole culture shift of how people have to learn to adapt to new ways of working. How do they understand what they do every single day? In Singapore, you hear a lot of talk about skills future, lifelong learning. How does all this help people get better jobs with the future? And I think that element of learning and how it actually happens on the ground needs to be not just recognized, but we need to think of it as an entire culture shift. Because I think once we start to understand that, data has all that value, we can do so much with it, then even how we respond to things like cyber breaches, cybersecurity breaches, how do you communicate with customers, what do you tell them, when do you tell them, when do the regulators get involved, all of that, in our industry, it's like, well, we know how to respond when there's a fire, but how do you respond when there's cybersecurity breaches? So
certainly, Kim Huat, a big issue for clients.
It is.
Yeah.
I was just going to first join in on what Piyush mentioned about ASEAN only come alive at night.
Right.
I was going to say the
Only grows
exception
at
is
night,
probably
yeah.
the Singapore government, because you have said what Minister Chan said. The Singapore is actually working on the new generation of digital economy agreements,
Right.
which works like FTA, so that they will provide financial and data connectivity. So on Kaping's point on actually cybersecurity, the challenge about it is very cross-border. You don't know where the crime or where the action takes place. It could be in a remote area,
Right.
in some faraway country. So it may be beyond your territory. So to effectively combat cybersecurity, I think we need a global order, more countries to come together rather than just single country alone.
Absolutely. Well, let's transition to talking about sustainability, another area where, of course, we need collective action. In Western markets, a lot of the focus is on ESG, but ESG is not as prominent a theme here in the financial sector as it is in the EU or the US or Japan. But that's ironic in some ways, Peng, starting with your comments on this, because the energy import costs are so high here in Asia. The capex that is continuing around oil and gas infrastructure is also very high. So there is a strong financial incentive, actually a fiscal incentive for governments to promote renewable energies. So, at Shell, you've been working on solar farms with the Singapore government. Can you give that example, but others around what is tangibly being done to promote sustainability here in ASEAN?
Well, I think the first point most people see is that, in many European countries, they've, the government is very much in front, right? Here's where we want to get to in 2030, 2040, 2045. And they have heavily used mandates to drive that change, which means that, look, you're going to have to get with it or think of something else. Now, I think in this part of the world, and we've seen this particularly in the last 12 to 18 months, governments do understand climate change. They do understand the urgency to act. Are they going to use the same approach? Maybe not, because I think, ASEAN is in a different state of competitiveness, at a different stage of economic development. So they are equally concerned about climate change. Now, then the question becomes, so how do you get there? Yeah, I think we see different governments reacting quite differently, at least acknowledging it, setting targets and ambition, and then encouraging activities in different ways. If I come back to Singapore, we have looked at the opportunities for solar in Singapore, recognizing that, look, Singapore does not really have a lot of space. Space comes at a huge premium. So you've got to then turn that around and say, okay, how else do you take an opportunity and then make it work for the country and then make it work for Shell, right? So I think the Semakau project is an excellent example where we know that it can work. We're going to try and make it work, but look, its primary use is a landfill. It's not a solar farm. So I think, with each of these, you've got to come down to, what can you do in that particular location? What is it that will make it work for the communities in that area, the government's concern, and then where can we come in as a company that will create value for us, for ourselves commercially?
Piyush, are you seeing anything in the arena of clean energy finance here in ASEAN or structured products in that area?
Yes, a lot. But Parag, let me again make 3 points. First up, in defense of ASEAN, if you will, the reality is that this region is still very dependent on fossil fuels, particularly thermal, geothermal, etc. Given the stage of development of the region, it's been well recognized both in the NDCs of the countries here, as well as actually in the projections of the International Energy Association, the IEA projections, that many of the countries, Indonesia, Myanmar, Vietnam, etc., will continue to have substantial reliance on thermal energy. All the way up to 2030, they're allowed to increase thermal energy before they start winding down. And therefore, we should not start with the prism that one size fits all. The bar for European countries is necessarily very different from the bar for a lot of the Asian countries. In fact, that's why, as part of the NDCs and as you know, the UN commitments, there's this whole thing about how do you do resource transfer from developed countries to developing countries. And I'm going to come back to that point, but that's one. Number two, having said that, the reality is that in the last year or two, and particularly with the pandemic, the focus and attention to the sustainability agenda has massively changed everywhere around the world. COP16 was a game changer, but with all of these commitments around the world in the last year or two, even the ASEAN countries are beginning to focus on seeing what they can do in substantial excess of their NDC commitments. And I'm beginning to see that. One part of this is the recognition that part of the solution is not just doing the transition of their own business systems, but also providing an opportunity for carbon credits and carbon offsets. And since the biggest providers of carbon credits and offsets are the nature-based solutions market, and the biggest nature-based solutions market or nature-based solutions providers are in our region, that is getting a lot of the ASEAN countries a lot more interested in this subject and in the game. Now, to your specific question, without a doubt, we're seeing a significant pickup in new forms of financing, renewable financing, for example. We set up a target of doing some $20 billion of renewable financing by 2024. And the amount and the pace picked up so rapidly that we've actually increased our targets to 50 billion. We are doing all kinds. We're doing geothermal, we're doing wind, we're doing solar, we're doing a whole range of things. And so you're beginning to see that attention and interest is increasing rapidly. But we're also seeing other opportunities. As you know, some of us launched collaboratively something we call the Carbon Exchange, or the Climate Impact X, which is to see if we can position and create a nature-based solution market in the region as well. So I think we're in early days, but there is a lot more interest and attention in the subject in the region as we go forward.
Excellent. No, those are great points. Huat, what about from the legal point of view? It isn't so much shareholder activism, obviously, but in the M&A space, there must be a fair bit of attempts to create economies of scale in whether it's the legal issues around implementation of transnational carbon markets, but also around the business opportunities that are taking place in investing in clean energy and renewables, depending on their geography, right?
Yes, it is. As we know, a lot of all this green investments is actually long-term commitment. So the government support is absolutely important. So in this sense, government's commitment to green is very important. I think the World Bank has cited Singapore 2030 Green Plan as an example, or the Indonesian government on moratorium against coal-fired plant as an example. So government commitment is very important for the green path. Secondly, we all know that COVID has led to a rise in public debt, actually. A lot of government has spent a lot on COVID. Yeah. So actually now a lot of the government will need private capital to help finance the green solutions. So these give opportunities for the private capital to come in, for banks like DBS and for Shell, all this private capital to come in to kickstart actually the green plan. Yep. Once you let the businessmen work out the sums, they will be able to get it right. So I think it's promising. There's actually a lot of opportunities in Southeast Asia for private companies to participate in our green plan.
So we've talked a lot about the role of the government in setting the bar and setting mandates. We've talked about the role of the private sector in providing capital and the markets. Let's hear about the consumer side of the picture. Caesar, could you weigh in on this? Consumer spending patterns, sustainability preferences of consumers. Are you seeing those signals already inside Traveloka, and as your diversification unfolds across different categories, are those signals strong?
Yeah, I think in terms of course, travel consumption patterns has changed from our data. We've seen that even though Southeast Asia is a big region, every market is different and has interesting behavior market by market. For example, in Indonesia, we've seen that domestic travel still happening, but the type of travel has changed. People would like to do more staycation. They really care about health and cleanliness, and that's why we do this Traveloka Clean program with our partners. While when we look at Vietnam, the behavior or preference also different. They prefer more flexibility. They still travel domestically, but want more flexibility on their ticket, and that's why we offer buy now, stay later, allowing that this consumer to have flexibility. In terms of lifestyle experiences, the demand is still strong. It's just the type of lifestyle services that they would like to purchase it has changed. So I mentioned about people previously like to go out and dine out with their friends, but now they prefer spending time at home and enjoying food delivered to home. Um, I believe looking ahead, I think of course travel will recover and lifestyle experience will continue to become popular especially among the young and aspirational middle class in Southeast Asia.
Excellent. We're going to transition in just a moment to finance and financial infrastructure as our kind of third major bucket. But I want to give Peng a chance to make any final comments, if you would like, on the sustainability issue.
Yeah, maybe a couple of points. So I think, Piyush talked a bit about the potential for nature-based solutions, carbon offsets, and the trading market that can emerge out of that. I think clearly that's an opportunity, particularly in Southeast Asia, given the countries that are involved. But I think it's something to be careful about. In Shell, we always say offset should be the last option, shouldn't be the first. And there are good reasons for that, right? So it's really, how do you avoid the emissions first? How do you reduce it? And then you talk about offset. So I think there's a hierarchy of, what needs to get prioritized. And both companies as well as governments have to kind of be in that same conversation. The second is really around, as we see these opportunities and as they emerge, how do you create that framework that is consistent, transparent, and will be, used to hold both governments and companies accountable. Yeah. So I think in Shell we do believe that level of transparency to be held accountable to is much needed. So whether we report our emissions year by year, country by country, what we're doing with it, whether we put our energy transition plan to a shareholder vote as we've done so in May of this year, all that is really how we promote that sense of, hey, this is accountability that we're prepared to stand behind. So I think those are just maybe some closing thoughts on this topic.
Sorry, Parag, just another closing thought.
Sure.
You tended to focus on the E of ESG. A lot of people conflate sustainability with environment and climate. Obviously those are important. But I think the other big opportunity in our region is the S. And frankly, the pandemic, more than anything, has heightened the awareness and attention on S relative to E. In our part of the world, most of ASEAN, we think about the Mekong area, Indochina, even countries, large countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam. There is still a tremendous opportunity at the bottom of the pyramid. And if you look at the level of banking sector penetration in a country like Indonesia, for example, it's around 30%. So the opportunity to actually start scaling up at the bottom of the pyramid, to outreach, to bring people into the financial safety net, to be able to create services for them, is what a lot of the fintechs and tech fins are capitalizing on. I think we cannot understate that opportunity and the need as well in the region.
No, that's an excellent point, and it goes back to Caesar's earlier point about financial inclusion, which is really happening in the digital domain very much. And can we use, to your point and Peng's point, can we use energy transition as a way of lowering the cost of participation in the economy and do so sustainably? I think those are very, very integrated points. So well put. Let's take our final issue around financial infrastructure. Now, this is different in some ways from just the financial agenda around integration, where Piyush made some very specific suggestions earlier. More broadly now, we do have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, e-commerce, green lanes, more cross-border activity. So let me ask you, Huat, around how we can nudge greater integration through the supply chain, the greater cross-border supply chain activities that are being encouraged by the trade agreements, even by the geopolitics, because this is an area that's going to unlock the complementarities between ASEAN countries much more radically than has happened thus far. As we know, for example, ASEAN countries have a very low a share of internal trade to their global trade. So, what more can be done in that area?
I think one of the most important harmonization is what I call common rules and standard.
Yep.
We all must operate under the same set of rules and agree to the same way which we would categorize certain products. Unless we have a common set of rules and standards, it's very difficult for things to flow. It brings to mind, how the maritime trade actually has exploded. After we all invented what we call the TUs, the 20 equivalent foot containers, then everybody would design warehouses, design how they store things according to this standard.
Absolutely.
Likewise, when it comes to data, Singapore actually is a strong position to see how do we define that standard. When it comes to carbon credits trading, how do we define that standards? I think that's very important.
Yeah.
And given that US and China are in strategic competition, none of them would want to adopt so-called the other party standard, then I think it gives opportunities for Singapore, for ASEAN to come up with a standard which we think is neutral, which I think can then, like an adapter, you can transit from AC to DC current and perform that function.
Right. So now we could also have common standards around regulations and requirements around stock market listings, listings on exchanges, so that we can have more multi-jurisdictional capital raising. Piyush, do you have a view on that? And while I'm asking you about that, how about the potential for, that should encourage ideally more of the reverse listings or homecoming listings, which has become something of a small trend in Hong Kong, maybe eventually in Singapore as well. How about SPACs that could benefit as well from this? What are your thoughts on that?
Parag, it's a fact that, tariff barriers in ASEAN have been very low now for a period of time. So the whole challenge in ASEAN is not, trade in goods has not been tariffed. There's been some in services. It has really been exactly this issue of non-tariff frictions that Kim Huat was referring to. Unfortunately, it's not been easy to get around that. I was part of the ASEAN Capital Markets Committee in about 15 years ago. And we spent 3 years working on how to get common standards for mutual recognition, harmonization, intermediary recognition, stock exchange listing rules, etc. And the fact is that the progress has been glacial. ASEAN doesn't have a strong Brussels which drives the agenda, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Now, the real opportunity, I think, comes from the digitization process. If instead of starting top-down to try and get standards alignment, we go bottom-up to try and create the digital infrastructures that work and allow for cross-connectivity of digital infrastructures that might allow us to push backwards and get to more consistent and common standards. We go back to the point I made. We're trying to link up with Thailand on the prompt pay system with Pay Now. So payments from Singapore can be sent to Thailand through a commonality of mobile numbers. The market participants on both sides had to spend many months coming to grips with how do you define a common set of protocols and standards for this kind of payment to happen. And so instead of approaching the problem top-down, we're approaching the problem bottoms-up. And my view is that the digitization of the region and the capacity to create these projects and approach the problem bottoms-up might give us an acceleration that we've not been able to achieve previously in the past. One of the things that is part of this Emerging Stronger task force we came up with was a common data infrastructure in Singapore, with the idea to create an end-to-end digitization of the Singapore side of the supply chain, right from the shipping to the port to the logistics, warehouse, trade financing, customs, etc. I hope we can streamline the digitization at this end, and then we start trying to work with the shippers and ports, etc., in other parts, other countries in ASEAN. That again would be a bottoms-up approach to trying to get this kind of rationalization, harmonization that we all see. Now, on the other question about capital, there is a massive amount of capital with a lot of interest to come into the region. I do think you'll see a lot more capital coming directly, but you'll also see a lot more SPACs. Already we are talking to companies listing SPACs in the US with the intent to invest them in ASEAN-centric opportunities. So I do think you're going to see a lot more of that. It's not clear to me that you'll see thriving exchanges in the region. I think the bulk of the exchange activity has shifted to North Asia. It's not going to be easy for Southeast Asia to sort of take up that pace. But if you really want to think about alternative sources of financing, which is not necessarily the direct equity market, but the debt capital markets, even as you go forward, alternative tokenized markets, you might start seeing more of that being attracted to the region in time.
Excellent points. Cesar, let's get your perspective from the standpoint of operating businesses that are moving across border, that are covering various sectors from hospitality, lifestyle, retail, and consumer goods. Which areas are you finding to be the most easy to internationalize versus where are there still the most frictions in terms of, again, non-tariff barriers and so forth? You're a perfect case study for everyone to learn from.
Yes, the easiest one to localize when we started exporting our product into other markets is, of course, the product itself. It's much easier to localize market by market. We just need to understand well about the local culture. Of course, when we start going into area that is highly regulated, there is so much uncertainty around local regulation. And hence we really need to understand well and work closely with the regulator and have an open communication with them, and make sure that our business model, commercial model, can be adjusted into the local law and regulation.
Huat, Piyush gave many examples of the kinds of shifts that we'll start to see in market activity as we get harmonization of standards. A lot of people, especially those viewing, have been hearing that RCEP is going to be a real game changer. That is going to be one of the triggers for harmonization of standards, for example, across different markets. But as we know, it is only being ratified incrementally. What is your view on RCEP and the role it's going to play here?
Well, if you were to look at RCEP, it's actually anchored by China and all of ASEAN, plus Korea, Japan, New Zealand, Australia. So already China is ASEAN's largest trading partner. So we are really talking about common standards, common rules. So it's not difficult. I think what RCEP could do is to actually expedite investments in other areas of the economy, like digital financing, digital infrastructure, green financing, green infrastructure. And those are some of the things that RCEP can help to achieve other than your traditional trades and investments.
Now we have time for a couple of sort of a wrap-up round, but let each of you speak for a couple of minutes on this. And it goes back really to modify the question that we asked at the beginning in the lightning round. When I asked you what you see as the biggest risk and the biggest opportunity. Here the question is, again, just focusing on ASEAN. What are the one or two big opportunities that you want to see ASEAN capture in the next 2 or 3 years? So we can go in any order, but we'll start actually with let's start with Peng.
Well, so in our business, we see ASEAN really as a fragmented collection of markets, right? That we're very familiar with. And as we think about energy transition, we see ASEAN bringing huge value, whether it's in nature-based solutions, providing feed which is renewable, getting value from waste. Waste plastic is a clear example where it's a huge issue in ASEAN. And so all of these are real opportunities that are realizable in the near 3 to 5 years. So, that's where we're focused on.
Yeah, I think for me, like typical Singaporean, I'll use an acronym, ISD. And I don't mean the Internal Security Department. Right. It means infrastructure, sustainability, and data. I think these three offers a lot of opportunities for ASEAN.
Very terse. Okay. Cesar.
For our business, I agree. I think data is very important, as we learned throughout the pandemic, where behavior in every market has changed, and in every market it's different. I think there's a big opportunity in data, especially around data analytics, and being able to generate real-time insight about the user and respond quickly. And it's very important for companies like us to really invest in data analytics capability to be able to get that business insights quickly. So it's basic.
Excellent, and certainly something that is definitely necessary across the region. And in the spirit of Minister Chan's remarks, both internal and external, now this has been a fascinating panel. We've covered a lot of ground on sustainability, on digitization, and on the financial and the investment landscape. So thank you so much to our distinguished panelists. This has been a really, really rich session, and now we're going to get to have 3 more breakouts for the participants around the world to select from, to participate in, to deep dive even further into some of these areas. But for now, thank you again so much for being with us, and we'll pass it back to Yvonne.
Thanks, Parag, for the great moderation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Parag.
Thank you.
Our distinguished speakers for that very engaging dialogue. I certainly enjoyed that conversation.
Thanks.
And I'm sure our audience also had many key takeaways from that robust conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm excited to move on to the final segment of our program today. And we have prepared, like Parag said, 3 breakout sessions for you. The first breakout session is titled Regional Trade, Security and Sustainability, Southeast Asia's Role in the New World Order. Moderating this session, we have Ms. Kala Anandaraja, the head of the Competition, Antitrust and Trade Practice at Rajah and Tann. Our panelists will highlight trade, security, sustainability, and supply chain considerations, as well as discuss related legal and practical challenges across the region. Moving on to our second breakout session for today, it's all about harnessing opportunities in Southeast Asia's digital transformation. Now, our panelists will discuss important changes in technology-related regulatory practices, as well as highlight key considerations in sectors that are undergoing digital transformation. Moderating this panel, we have Mr. Rajesh Srivanasan. He's the head of TMT practice at Rajah and Tann, and Rajesh is also the director of Rajah and Tann Cybersecurities and Rajah and Tann Technologies. So you're in good hands there. And wrapping up our breakout sessions is the third one, Investment Trends and Strategies. We'll be spotlighting fundraising, M&A, and investment activities in Southeast Asia. Ms. Sandy Fu, the partner at the M&A department in Rajah and Tann, will be moderating this session, and our panelists will share their insights and identify opportunities in major market groups across the region, and they will also be discussing investment and deal-making strategies in light of the current global market trends. So there you have it. 3 fascinating breakout sessions with policymakers, business leaders, and leading lawyers for you to choose from. A post-event recording will be made available for those of you who wish to hear from other sessions. You can now join the breakout sessions by clicking on the Sessions tab at the right-hand side of your screen. And if you'd like to find out more about each panel or breakout session panelist, you can go to our event website at globalevent.rajatanasia.com, and you can join into any session at any time. And with that, I'd like to wrap up the main segment of our program today. Thank you so much for joining us for Rajah and Tann Asia's inaugural global marquee event, Beyond Pandemic and Politics, Behold Southeast Asia and the World. We do hope that the sharing today will give you more clarity as you navigate a challenging landscape despite the shifting tides of global, political, and economic changes. My name is Yvonne Chan. It's been a pleasure hosting you today. We will see you at the breakout sessions. Thank you.